The year was 1987, and I'll never forget it. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air smells like wood smoke and the leaves crunch underfoot. I was a fifth grader back then, wide-eyed and full of excitement, especially when it came to anything spooky. The school trip to Harpersville Manor felt like a dream come true, an old house from the 1800s, steeped in history and haunted, if you believed the rumors. And I believed them. Timmy Barton. That's a name I still can't get out of my head, even all these years later. He was the kind of kid who ate up ghost stories, like me. We shared stories on the bus ride over about how maybe we'd be the ones to finally see something. Maybe we'd catch a glimpse of a ghost in one of the dark corners, or feel a chill on the back of our necks. I remember how the bus rumbled down the long, narrow road to the manor, the wheels kicking up leaves behind us. The place itself was massive, tall, with weathered brick and ivy creeping up its walls. As we stood outside, waiting for the tour to start, I noticed the windows. Some were boarded up, and others had curtains drawn tight, but there was one on the second floor, high up, that wasn't, and I swear I saw someone looking down at us. I nudged Timmy and pointed it out, but when we both looked back, the window was empty. Probably just a shadow, Timmy said, though I could tell he was rattled. That's when I first felt it, an unsettling twinge in my gut, like something wasn't right. The tour started with an old woman leading us inside, her voice light and cheerful as she told us about the manor's history. She had this smile, but there was something about it that felt off. The more she talked, the more I noticed how she avoided certain questions. Like when one of the teachers asked about the manor's basement, she just chuckled and moved on. Or when Timmy, always the curious one, asked about the rumors of hauntings, she waved it off like it was nothing. But the stories she did tell were full of tragedy. Families that had lived there, people who had died, and one story in particular about a boy, about our age, who had gone missing in the manor back in the 1920s. His body was never found, she said, but sometimes people claimed they heard him laughing or saw him out of the corner of their eye. As we moved from room to room, I felt a coldness creeping in, the kind that crawls up your spine and makes you want to leave. The rooms were filled with dusty old furniture and portraits of people long dead, their eyes following us wherever we went. Timmy was eating it up, snapping photos with a disposable camera, grinning like he was having the time of his life. And then, just like that, he was gone. I didn't even realize it at first. One minute he was right behind me, and the next, he wasn't. At first I thought he'd wandered off, maybe to find one of those secret passageways the guide had mentioned. But when the teachers started calling his name, the pit in my stomach opened wider. Timmy wasn't the kind of kid to disappear like that, not without saying something. We searched the whole manor, room by room, calling for him. I remember running down the long, narrow hallways, my voice echoing off the walls, but hearing nothing in return. His name seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the house itself. Hours passed. The tour was supposed to be over, but nobody was leaving. The teachers were frantic, and the police were called. Search parties combed the surrounding woods, but there was no trace of Timmy. That night, as we sat on the bus waiting for our parents, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, watching me. I looked up at that same window on the second floor, and this time I knew for sure. I wasn't imagining it. There was a face there, pale, like a child's, staring straight at me. I turned to get someone's attention, but by the time I looked back, it was gone. Weeks passed, and Timmy never came home. The school tried to move on, but none of us could. His disappearance consumed me. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was back in the manor, walking through its halls, but always alone. In those dreams, I could hear Timmy's voice calling for help, muffled and distant, like he was just out of reach. But no matter how fast I ran, I could never find him. Then, one night, I did something stupid. I snuck back to Harpersville Manor. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about him. I had to know what happened. I took a flashlight and made my way through the woods, heart pounding with every step. The manor looked even more imposing in the dark, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at me. The front door was locked, of course, but I found a way in through a broken window in the back. The place was silent, like the air had been sucked out of it. I wandered through the dark rooms, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick dust. It felt wrong being there, like the house knew I wasn't supposed to be inside. And then I heard it. A laugh. A child's laugh, echoing through the halls. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I followed the sound, down a narrow corridor, past the library, and into a room at the back of the house. It was cold, so cold my breath fogged up in front of me, and there, in the corner, was Timmy's camera, lying on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I heard it again, the laugh, right behind me. I turned, and for the briefest moment, I saw him, Timmy, standing in the doorway, pale as a ghost, his eyes wide and empty. Then he was gone. I ran out of that house as fast as I could, the sound of his laughter still ringing in my ears. I never went back. None of us did. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear him. Our senior trip to New York City was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of freedom before the real world came crashing down on us after graduation. We were just a bunch of small-town kids from upstate New York, eager to see the city, to be swallowed up by its lights and chaos. It was 1997, and we thought we were invincible, like nothing could touch us. Little did we know, our perception of the world would change forever that day. The Museum of Science was the first stop. It was supposed to be a fun, educational start to the trip before we hit Times Square, and maybe even catch a Broadway show. But as soon as we entered the museum, something felt off. At first it was subtle, just a prickle at the back of my neck, a faint sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, this was my first time in the big city. But as we moved through the exhibits, that feeling grew. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like the building itself was holding its breath. My friends didn't seem to notice. They were snapping pictures, laughing, and shoving each other playfully as we wandered past massive dinosaur skeletons and glowing displays about space and the human body. Our chaperones were struggling to keep track of everyone, shouting every now and then for us to stay together. Then the announcement came. The crackle of the PA system cut through the din of the museum, and a voice, a woman's voice, strained and anxious, came on, saying something that sent a chill straight through me. "Attention, visitors. We have an emergency situation. A convicted felon has escaped custody nearby. For your safety, the museum is now in lockdown." The words echoed in my ears, and suddenly, the world felt smaller, darker. I could see the fear ripple through the crowd, parents pulling their children close, the tourists and school groups all glancing around in panic. The staff moved quickly, ushering everyone toward a large auditorium. We were herded like cattle, and the noise of the crowd grew louder as panic set in. Inside the auditorium, the lights were dim, save for a few emergency bulbs casting long flickering shadows across the walls. I sat down with my friends, Jake and Tony, trying to act calm, but my hands were shaking. The room buzzed with nervous whispers, and I could feel the tension mounting, like the air itself was charged with electricity. An hour passed, maybe more. Time felt sluggish, like we were stuck in some strange, liminal space between safety and chaos. The police were supposedly swarming the building, looking for the convict, but there was no sign of them. The only sound was the low murmur of the crowd and the occasional creak of the auditorium doors as a museum staff member peeked inside. Then it happened. A scream, a raw, blood-curdling scream, tore through the room, freezing everyone in place. It came from the back of the auditorium, near the darkened hallway that led out toward the museum exhibits. Heads turned, eyes wide with terror, as more screams followed, high-pitched and frantic. Someone shouted, pointing toward the shadows. That's when I saw him. At first it was just a silhouette, a tall, looming figure, standing motionless in the hallway. But as the flickering light caught his face, my heart stopped. His prison uniform was torn and filthy, his skin slick with sweat and grime, his eyes, wild, desperate, locked onto us, scanning the crowd with a terrifying intensity. The escaped convict. He'd been hiding among us all along. Panic erupted. People scrambled over seats, trying to get as far away from the hallway as possible. Some of the younger kids were crying, clutching onto their parents or friends. Jake grabbed my arm, his knuckles white with fear. "We have to go, man. Now." But there was nowhere to go. The doors were locked, and the auditorium was packed with people. The only way out was through the hallway where he stood, watching us like a predator sizing up his prey. Suddenly, he moved, quick, almost too quick for my brain to process. He darted into the crowd, disappearing among the chaos. More screams followed, and I could hear the thud of people hitting the floor, trying to escape, tripping over each other in their panic. I don't know what came over me, but I stood up, my legs shaking. I could see him, weaving through the mass of bodies like a shadow, always just out of reach, but getting closer. His eyes flicked to me, just for a second, and I froze. He was coming for me. I could feel it in my bones. "Run!" Tony shouted, snapping me out of my daze. We pushed through the crowd, trying to get to the back of the room where the staff had been standing earlier. Maybe there was another exit. Maybe we could find a way out before he caught up to us. The screams grew louder, and I could hear footsteps, heavy, pounding footsteps behind us. I glanced back just for a moment and saw him again, pushing through the crowd like a shark cutting through water. His eyes were locked on mine now, and there was a look of pure rage on his face. We reached the back of the room, but there was no door, no way out. We were trapped. Then, out of nowhere, the auditorium doors burst open. Police officers flooded the room, shouting commands, their guns drawn. The convict froze, caught in the beam of a flashlight. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and then he lunged, straight at me. I don't remember much after that. There was a struggle, the sound of gunshots, the feeling of cold, rough hands grabbing me. And then, darkness. When I woke up, the room was empty. The convict was dead, shot down by the police. But the terror he left behind lingered, hanging over us like a shadow we could never shake. That day, we learned a different kind of lesson, one that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The world outside our small town wasn't just full of lights and possibilities. It was full of darkness, too, waiting to catch us when we least expected it. I'll never forget the way the air smelled that night. Pine needles, wood smoke, and something else. Something I can only describe as wrong. It clung to the back of my throat, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting. But we were kids. High school seniors on a camping trip led by Miss Carter, our overly eager English teacher. She wanted to bond with us, help us escape the pressures of exams and the future looming over our heads. At the time, it seemed like a great idea. It was late October, 2008, the perfect weekend for an outdoor adventure at Red Oak Campgrounds, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The first day was uneventful, just hiking, laughing, and taking in the fresh air. But as night fell, something changed. Maybe it was the way the light from the campfire flickered across the trees, casting long, jagged shadows, or the way the wind seemed to whisper in a language none of us understood. Whatever it was, I should have listened to my gut when it told me something was wrong. Miss Carter had promised us ghost stories that night, something she thought would be fun. We gathered around the fire, our faces lit by the warm glow as she told us about a group of hikers who had gone missing in these very woods. She spoke of their bones being found years later, scattered like leaves, and of the locals who whispered about the watchers in the woods. We all laughed nervously, brushing it off as just a story. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the shadows, darting just beyond the fire's light. At first I thought it was my imagination, the product of too many scary stories and too little sleep. But then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes, like something or someone moving out there, just beyond where the light could reach. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my friend Mark, who sat beside me on a log. He nodded, his face pale. I could see it in his eyes. He heard it too. Before we could react, a scream tore through the night. Not the playful kind of scream you'd expect from someone trying to scare their friends, but a scream that chilled your blood. We all jumped up, shining our flashlights wildly into the darkness. The scream came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. "Stay together!" Miss Carter shouted, but her voice trembled, betraying her fear. I looked around. Some of the others were crying, their bravado completely gone. We were just a bunch of kids who thought this trip would be fun, and now it felt like something was hunting us. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its eyes were glowing red. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't move like a person. Its limbs jerked unnaturally, contorting in ways that made my stomach churn. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. The figure took a step closer, and I felt my heart seize in my chest. Its face was obscured by shadow, but those eyes, they locked onto mine, burning with something ancient, something malevolent. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I lost sight of it. When the beam steadied, the figure was gone. Panic set in. Miss Carter yelled for us to run, but she didn't need to. We bolted, scattering into the trees like terrified animals, our screams mixing with the howling wind. My legs burned as I ran, dodging low branches and leaping over fallen logs, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, following close behind. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, my lungs on fire, my heart slamming against my ribcage. I could still hear them, my classmates, screaming somewhere in the distance. But the figure, it was always just behind me, no matter how fast I ran or how far I thought I'd gone. Its footsteps were slow, methodical, like it knew it didn't have to rush. It would catch me eventually. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled out onto the dirt road that led back to town. I collapsed, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, there was silence, just the wind and the rustling of leaves. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd escaped. But then I heard it, that low, guttural growl. I turned slowly, my body rigid with terror. There it was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Its red eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, its twisted body swaying unnaturally, as if the very act of standing was a struggle. For the briefest moment I locked eyes with it, and in that moment I knew. This thing wasn't human. It was something far older, something that had been here long before we came, and it would still be here long after we were gone. It was patient, and it would wait, until I was alone again. I don't know how I made it back to town. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital, my classmates and Miss Carter beside me, all of us pale, shaken, and haunted by the same nightmare. We never spoke of what happened that night at Red Oak. No one would believe us if we did. But I can still see those red eyes, watching me from the shadows. And I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting for me to return.